Imagine it's the evening of August 28th, 1859. You are a telegraph operator named Thomas, 26 years old, working the night shift at the American Telegraph Company office in Pittsburgh. You have a good job. In fact, you have one of the most modern, skilled, and well-paying jobs that exists in the industrialized world. You have spent 3 years learning Morse code at the speed of 30 words a minute. You have memorized the routing protocols for every major line east of the Mississippi. Your employer has invested heavily in the newest Bain chemical telegraph equipment. The lines running out of your office connect to New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Boston. On a good night, you can relay a message from a Pittsburgh merchant to a New York broker in under 4 minutes. In a world where a letter takes 3 days and a ship takes 3 weeks, 4 minutes is something close to magic. You sit down at your instrument at 10 o'clock. Almost immediately, the needle begins to move without you touching it. You check the connections, you check the battery. Everything is in order. The needle moves again. Then it moves continuously, writing gibberish across the paper tape in long, stuttering streams that correspond to no code you have ever been taught. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The line hisses, then it screams. You reach for the key to signal the New York office and receive a shock that throws your hand back from the instrument. The paper tape catches fire. By morning, Aurora Borealis, the northern lights, is visible as far south as Cuba and Hawaii. Gold miners in the Rocky Mountains wake at 1 in the morning convinced it is dawn and begin making breakfast. The sky over Boston turns crimson. Over New Orleans, it glows green. Across the continental United States, every telegraph line in operation is either dead, sparking, or running on the current generated by the storm itself, a current from the sky that requires no battery, follows no schedule, and obeys no operator. This is the Carrington event, and for 5 specific categories of assets, it did not merely disrupt value, it erased it, overnight, completely. Not because the assets were poorly chosen, not because the people who held them were careless or naive, but because every single one of those assets was built on a single invisible assumption that no one had ever thought to question. Before we go through them, you need to understand what actually happened, because most people imagine solar storms as weather, as something diffuse and atmospheric, the kind of event that inconveniences satellites and makes the sky pretty. The Carrington event was not weather, it was a direct electromagnetic hit. On September 1st, 1859, the British astronomer Richard Carrington was sketching a large cluster of sunspots when he witnessed something no human being had ever consciously observed, a solar flare. A sudden, brilliant eruption of light from the surface of the sun, lasting approximately 5 minutes. Carrington noted the time, 11:18 a.m., and published his observation in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, where it would sit largely unremarked for the next century and a half. 17 hours and 40 minutes later, a coronal mass ejection, a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma, traveling at roughly 7 million miles per hour, struck the Earth's magnetic field. The geomagnetic storm that followed was, by every measurement instrument of the era, the largest ever recorded. Magnetometers at the Kew Observatory in London went off scale. Telegraph systems across North America and Europe simultaneously failed, sparked, caught fire, and in several documented cases continued operating for hours with no battery power at all, driven entirely by the induced current from the storm. The event lasted roughly 2 days. When it was over, the sky returned to normal. The sun looked the same. The land was undamaged. No building had collapsed. No crop had failed. No army had invaded. And yet 5 specific categories of assets had been rendered completely, functionally, in some cases permanently useless, not damaged. The mechanism was not destruction. It was disconnection. And the assets that disconnected were not random. They followed a pattern, the same pattern they always follow. They were the assets that the most modern, most sophisticated, most economically integrated people of 1859 were most encouraged to hold. The first asset, the telegraph network itself. The telegraph in 1859 was not a convenience, it was the central nervous system of the entire mid-19th century economy. To understand what that means, you have to understand what commercial life looked like before it. A cotton merchant in New Orleans could not know what cotton was selling for in New York until a letter arrived, which took 3 days at minimum. A railroad company could not coordinate train movements across a 100-mile stretch of track without riders carrying written orders. A bank in Philadelphia could not verify whether a draft drawn in Cincinnati was legitimate or fraudulent. Every commercial relationship beyond a day's horse ride operated on a foundation of lag, uncertainty, trust extended across time. The telegraph collapsed all of that. By 1859, there were roughly 50,000 miles of telegraph wire in the United States alone. Major financial institutions paid subscription fees for commodity price services delivered by wire every morning. Insurance companies adjusted their underwriting based on shipping intelligence transmitted from port cities in near real time. Railroad companies had built their entire operational model around telegraph dispatch train orders, without which 2 trains on the same track could not avoid collision. The people who had invested in this infrastructure, the wire, the equipment, the trained operators, the routing stations, had not made a speculative bet. They had made what looked like the most rational, evidence-backed, future-proof investment possible. The technology worked. The revenue was real. The demand was growing. This was not a bubble. It was the backbone of modern commerce. On the morning of September 2nd, 1859, it was useless. The mechanism matters. The induced geomagnetic current running through the telegraph wires was not simply interference. It was, in many cases, stronger than the current the batteries themselves generated. It reversed polarity without warning. It spiked without warning. Operators who touched their instruments received shocks. Paper tape and recording machines caught fire. Switches fused. Batteries were irrelevant because the problem was not a lack of current, but an overwhelming, uncontrollable surplus of it. The Pittsburgh operator Thomas and his counterparts across North America did not lose their infrastructure to theft or fire or flood. They lost it to an electromagnetic environment that rendered the technology's core operating assumptions impossible to fulfill. Every message sent during the storm was corrupted or undeliverable. Every time-sensitive commercial transaction that depended on wire communication, and by 1859, a very large portion of all commercial transactions in industrialized economies had to be delayed, abandoned, or conducted through the slower, more expensive methods the telegraph had replaced. What happened to the financial value embedded in that infrastructure during those 2 days is instructive. The assets themselves, the wire, the equipment, the buildings, were largely undamaged. But the value of a telegraph network is not its physical components. It is its ability to transmit information. Remove that ability and the rest is scrap. The telegraph had made itself indispensable. That was its strength. When it failed, the economy had no redundancy to fall back on. It had optimized so completely around the new technology that the older, slower methods had atrophied. The coaches that had carried letters no longer ran on those schedules. The brokers who had relied on personal networks had shifted to wire services. The competencies for operating without the telegraph had been abandoned precisely because the telegraph worked so well. The second asset: magnetic navigation systems. In 1859, the magnetic compass was the indispensable instrument of maritime and survey navigation. Every ship at sea outside of visible coastal landmarks depended on it. Naval officers tracked their magnetic heading continuously. Surveyors planning railroad routes through unmapped Western territory used magnetic bearings as their primary orientation tool. The entire cartographic infrastructure of American westward expansion was being built, mile by mile, on magnetic north. The Carrington event disrupted the Earth's magnetic field so severely that compass needles in observatories across Europe and North America swung wildly, sometimes pointing south instead of north, sometimes spinning without settling. The disruption lasted, in various intensities, for more than 40 hours. A ship that departed port on September 1st, navigating by compass, found itself on September 2nd with an instrument that gave different readings every time it was consulted. A surveying team working in the Wyoming Territory found their instruments recording headings that bore no reliable relationship to the terrain features they were mapping. The compass did not break. It still responded to magnetic fields. The problem was that the magnetic field it was responding to had become, temporarily, a lie. This is the mechanism that most people miss. The value of a navigation instrument is not intrinsic to the instrument. It is a function of the relationship between the instrument and the stable, predictable environment the instrument is designed to read. Disrupt the environment, and the instrument, no matter how finely made, no matter how expensive, no matter how well maintained, becomes not merely imprecise, but actively misleading. A compass that points wrong is worse than no compass at all. It gives confidence to errors. Ships that had set their course by compass before the storm and then maintained that course through the disruption arrived somewhere other than where they intended, sometimes dangerously so. Surveys conducted during the event had to be entirely redone, at significant expense, once the magnetic field returned to normal. The compasses themselves survived, of course, physically intact, mechanically functional, commercially worthless for approximately 40 hours and unreliable for days afterward as the geomagnetic environment slowly stabilized. The third asset: long-distance financial instruments. By 1859, a new category of financial product had emerged in industrialized economies that was entirely dependent on instantaneous long-distance communication. Commodity futures, arbitrage positions, bills of exchange keyed to real-time price differentials between distant markets, insurance instruments whose pricing was adjusted on the fly based on intelligence from distant ports, all of it built on the telegraph's ability to make distant markets effectively simultaneous. The entire logic of arbitrage, buying something where it is cheap and selling it where it is expensive, depends on information moving faster than goods. In the pre-telegraph era, a merchant who knew that cotton was 50 cents a pound in New Orleans and 62 cents in New York could profit from that difference. But so could everyone else with a fast ship, and by the time the cotton arrived in New York, the price might have moved. The telegraph changed this. It made price differentials actionable in real time. It made distant markets into a single market. This was not theoretical. By 1859, financial houses in New York, London, and Liverpool had built entire trading operations around wire-dependent price intelligence. A firm in New York might hold a position based on information received from Liverpool that morning, information that would take 3 weeks to arrive by ship. That information advantage was the entire basis of the trade. During the Carrington event, that information advantage vanished. Positions entered into based on price intelligence received before the storm were held through a period of complete informational blackout. The markets, the positions referenced, continued to move. Goods continued to arrive in ports, prices continued to shift, but no one in New York knew what was happening in Liverpool, and no one in Liverpool knew what was happening in New York. For 2 days, every long-distance financial position in existence became a bet made in the dark. The damage was not merely financial, it was revelatory. It exposed something that the participants had understood intellectually, but had never had to confront operationally. Every financial instrument whose value depended on real-time information was, in the absence of that information, worth exactly as much as a guess. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fourth asset, railroad coordination infrastructure. In 1859, the railroad was the most capital-intensive industry in the United States. The total investment in American rail infrastructure by that year exceeded $1 billion more capital than had been invested in any other industrial sector in the nation's history. That investment was not just in track and locomotives, it was in a system, and the system depended entirely on the telegraph. Here is why. A single-track railroad line, which was the standard for most American rail in 1859, requires a mechanism for ensuring that two trains traveling in opposite directions do not occupy the same stretch of track at the same time. The mechanism was the telegraph. Station agents sent and received train orders by wire. A train could not legally depart a station until it had received a telegraphed confirmation that the opposing train had cleared the relevant section. Remove the telegraph and the entire dispatch system which governed train movements across thousands of miles of track became inoperable. Not slow, not imprecise, inoperable. Operating a train without valid dispatch authorization on a single-track line was not a regulatory violation. It was how collisions happened. During the Carrington event, railroad companies across the northeastern United States and parts of Europe were forced to stop trains in place and hold them until the telegraph lines could be verified as functional. This was the only safe option. Trains sat in stations and on sidings for hours, schedules collapsed, cargo sat, passengers waited, the value embedded in those schedules, the commitments made to shippers, the time-sensitive deliveries arranged around precise timetables, all of it became undeliverable overnight. The trains themselves were undamaged. The track was undamaged. The locomotives were fully operational. None of the physical capital of the railroad system had been touched, but the system it operated within had been severed, and a locomotive without a functioning dispatch system is not a revenue-generating asset. It is a very expensive, very stationary object consuming maintenance costs and crew wages while generating nothing. This is the mechanism with infrastructure assets. A railroad is not a collection of physical components. It is a network. Its value is a function of its connectedness. Remove the connectedness and the physical components retain only their scrap value. The fifth asset, the reputation and credit of instantaneous commerce. This fifth category is the most abstract and in some ways the most consequential. By 1859, a new kind of commercial trust had emerged in industrialized economies, a trust built not on personal relationships and face-to-face verification, but on the ability to transmit information, confirm identities, and coordinate transactions across vast distances in real time. A merchant in Chicago could extend credit to a buyer in San Francisco because he could telegraph a bank in San Francisco to verify the buyer's standing before committing. A shipper in New York could accept a cargo contract from a merchant in London because the contract price could be confirmed against the current market rate, transmitted by wire that morning. A financier could underwrite a bond for a railroad in Missouri because he could wire his agents in St. Louis to verify the project's status before signing. All of this, the entire architecture of long-distance commercial credit and contract, rested on the ability to verify, in near real time, the information that the counterparty was presenting. During the Carrington event, that verification infrastructure ceased to exist. And here's what that meant for commercial credit specifically. A merchant who had arranged to take delivery of a large cargo on September 2nd, arranged on the basis of wire-confirmed prices and wire-verified credit, found himself, on September 2nd, unable to confirm anything. The price might have moved, the credit might have changed. The counterparty's circumstances, confirmed by wire the previous week, might have shifted in ways that were impossible to know. The rational response to this, the commercially prudent response, was to pause, to wait, to hold commitments until verification was possible again. That pause had a cost. Every commercial transaction deferred during those 2 days represented lost velocity in an economy that had, in the span of 15 years, reorganized itself around instantaneous velocity. The momentum that the telegraph had created was its own form of fragility. A sudden halt, even a short one, created backlogs, missed obligations, and defaults that cascaded through interconnected commercial networks in ways that were difficult to predict and impossible to stop cleanly. The reputation for reliability that had been built up over years by wire-dependent commercial institutions, the implicit promise that wire-confirmed information could be trusted as a basis for action, had been exposed as conditional, reliable when the wire was working, paralyzed when it wasn't. The pattern, step back from the 5 individual categories and look at what they share. The telegraph network. magnetic navigation, long-distance financial instruments, railroad coordination, wire-dependent commercial credit. What do these 5 categories have in common? They are the 5 pillars of modern economic integration in 1859. They are what distinguished a developed, industrialized, commercially sophisticated economy from a primitive one. They are what the most capable, most forward-thinking, most economically rational people of that era had built their professional lives and financial positions around. And every single one of them depended, completely and without redundancy, on a single invisible infrastructure layer that no one had consciously chosen to rely on because it had never been necessary to think about it. It simply worked. It had always worked. It was, for all practical purposes, assumed to be part of the permanent operating environment, until it wasn't. This is the mechanism that the Carrington event reveals. Not economic mismanagement, not institutional failure, not greed or recklessness or bad policy, just a single catastrophic reminder that the infrastructure layer your entire economy is built on top of is not the same thing as the ground. The ground is always there. Infrastructure is a human construction, and human constructions have failure modes. Some of those failure modes have never been triggered in living memory. Some have never been triggered at all. That does not mean they don't exist. It means they haven't happened yet. In 1859, the failure mode for geomagnetically induced current in long conductor systems had never been triggered at this scale. The people who built the telegraph network were not stupid. They were brilliant. They simply designed their system for the electromagnetic environment they had observed, which was the only environment they had ever experienced. The Carrington event was not in their model because nothing like it had occurred since the era of electromagnetic infrastructure began. The assets that survived, the farms producing food, the physical gold and silver in private hands, the face-to-face commercial relationships maintained at the local level, the practical skills of craftsmen and traders who operated without wire infrastructure, survived for the same reason these categories always survive systemic disruptions. They did not require the disrupted system to function. Richard Carrington made his observation in 1859 and published it, and science moved on. For most of the following century and a half, the Carrington event was a historical curiosity, interesting to astronomers, irrelevant to economists and financial planners and the architects of modern infrastructure. That assessment has changed. In 1989, a far smaller geomagnetic storm, estimated at roughly 1/3 the intensity of the Carrington event, knocked out the entire Hydro-Quebec power grid in 90 seconds and left 6 million people without electricity for 9 hours. Transformers in New Jersey were damaged. Satellites experienced control anomalies. The aurora was visible in Texas. In 2003, the Halloween storms damaged infrastructure across multiple countries, temporarily blinded some satellite systems, and forced the rerouting of commercial aircraft across North Atlantic corridors. In 2012, a coronal mass ejection of Carrington-class magnitude was released by the Sun. It missed the Earth by approximately 9 days, a narrow margin in solar terms. Scientists at NASA later described it as a near miss of historic proportions. The 5 categories of modern assets that would become useless overnight in a Carrington-class event today are more numerous, more deeply embedded, and more globally interconnected than anything that existed in 1859. The entire digital financial system, GPS-dependent navigation and logistics, internet-connected supply chain management, real-time credit and payment infrastructure, power grid-dependent manufacturing. None of these systems was designed with a Carrington-class event in its baseline threat model. Most of them have never operated through a major geomagnetic storm of any significant scale. Their failure modes in that environment have been modeled theoretically but never tested operationally. The historical record does not predict when a Carrington-class event will occur again, but it is unambiguous that such events occur. The Sun does not consult the financial system before releasing a coronal mass ejection. What the historical record does tell us, from the Pittsburgh Telegraph Office in 1859, from the Quebec blackout in 1989, from the 2012 near miss, is what it tells us in every financial autopsy this channel has examined. The assets most at risk are not the ones that seem fragile. They are the ones that seem so fundamental, so pervasive, so invisibly embedded in the operating environment that the possibility of their failure has stopped being thinkable. The telegraph was not considered vulnerable in 1859 because it had never failed catastrophically. Modern digital infrastructure is not considered vulnerable today for exactly the same reason. Thomas, the Pittsburgh telegraph operator, sat down at his instrument on the night of August 28, 1859, at the apex of the most advanced communication technology in human history. By morning, that technology was burning. He had done nothing wrong. His equipment was in perfect order. His skills were real. His employer's investment was rational. The system simply encountered a condition it was not designed for. The system you are most deeply embedded in right now was also not designed for every condition that exists. History is explicit on this point. The question is not whether your infrastructure has a failure mode. Everything built by human beings has failure modes. The question is whether you have thought about yours before the sky turns red. This channel does not predict the future. It dissects the past, so the patterns become visible before they become personal. If that kind of clarity matters to you, subscribing is the simplest way to stay informed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.